the beginning. See it now, right?
Yep.
Okay. There you go. Now it's working. So if peonies are so easy to grow, why isn't everyone growing them? Any of the people listening who are growing them know they're fairly easy to grow, but they always can, like any crop, can have their problems you have to deal with. So if anyone's out there who's not growing them yet, there's no reason not to start to grow them. They grow in USDA zone 3 to 8, with the soil pH pretty neutral, 6.5 to 7. The trick with growing them in the warmer areas, even parts of the zone 8, or there are people in zone 9 that will grow some peonies, is they need to have a daily low temperature below 40 degrees Fahrenheit for at least 6 weeks over the winter. John had mentioned that in Israel they're doing some forcing peonies by cooling the roots, growing them either pots or crates, and then they move them to into a cooler for that 6 weeks, and then they bring them out to grow them in a greenhouse. So if you're in that area that has the borderline almost not cold enough to grow peonies, there are ways you can try and get around it. One is to plant them a little closer to the surface. Make sure they're on a south-facing slope. I'm sorry, not south, north-facing slope, so they don't get any of the solar heat gain in the winter. So if you're in a zone 8 and warmer, there is ways you can try and do peonies. You want to make sure you start with good quality rootstock. You want to buy firm roots when you get them. They should never be mushy or soft or dried out. They should be freshly dug, or sometimes if you're planting in the spring, they were dug the fall before and stored in cold storage. We want to make sure that they're good, healthy roots. Fairly large amount of root mass. Look sometimes like big carrots or chunky roots. I'll show a picture in a minute. And that you have visible eyes on the plant, which means that you can see the sprouts for next year. You want to make sure you buy your roots wholesale. You don't want to go to Home Depot or to the garden center to buy them, because if you're trying to grow a crop commercially and make a profit, you want to buy at wholesale prices, and therefore you buy in wholesale quantities. There are domestic peony farms that grow peonies and sell them, and there's also places that import ones either from, most likely Holland, but also Israel peony roots, and there are even some that come from New Zealand or Australia. But mainly it would be either domestic or imported from Holland. The important thing is always order your peonies way before you want to plant them. If you think you're going to be planting out peonies in October, don't call up your supplier in October looking for peonies, because they probably don't have many, or if they have any left, there's very few and maybe not the varieties that you wanted to grow. Our general rule of thumb here at Ednie is that you order your peonies by early August for delivery in delivery in October. We put out the list actually back in May. So anybody who's selling peonies will usually know what is available to ship to you in the fall by late spring. And you want to get your order in as soon as possible, because no matter where you're ordering from, there's a limited number available. Even if it's the biggest grower in the world, they've only got 10,000 Sarah Bernhardts to sell. When those are gone, they're gone. And if you were the last person that ordered them, you won't get them. So you want to plan ahead and order in advance. The next big question is what size to buy. They basically usually come commercially either 2 to 3i or 3 to 5i. And if you look at the picture here, the eyes are the little pinkish color sprouts here. And one that is a 2 to 3i would have at least 2 eyes, maybe 3, sometimes more, but no fewer than 2. 3 to 5i would have 3 minimum, up to 5, sometimes more if it's a good year, and there might be a higher bud count. The way to decide which you want to buy, usually the price difference isn't a huge amount between the two sizes. The more expensive the peonies, some of the newer varieties, there's some varieties out there that are $20 or $30 per root because they've only been around for 4 or 5 years maybe. The difference between the 2 to 3i might be $20 and 3 to 5i might be $30. Whereas if you're getting a much more common, like the Sarah Bernhardt that's been around for 100 years, a 3 to 5i root might be $2.95 and a 3 to 5 might be $3.40. So it's only a 50 cents or dollar difference. It's definitely worth buying the bigger root because you'll get a production from that plant sooner. If you're planning in advance and just starting your peony farm, you might go with more 2 to 3i so you can get more plants, but you're not planning to sell for longer. You're not trying to get a crop to harvest the next 2 or 3 years. You're willing to wait 4 or 5 years. Then there's always the debate about when to plant your peonies, whether you plant them in the fall or the spring. I like to say planting in the fall is best, but if you don't get them planted this fall, next spring is better than next fall because you're 6 or 9 months earlier in the ground. The sooner you get them in the ground, the sooner they're going to produce a sellable stem for you. So if you didn't get them planted this fall and you want to plant peonies, you can still plant them this now if your ground's not frozen and somebody has them available to buy from them, or you can plant them in the spring, or if you don't get them in the spring, the next fall is the next best time to plant them. I would like to say the sooner you plant them, the better. Don't think about spring or fall, just get them in as soon as you can, and if springtime is as soon as you can do it, that's better than waiting until next fall. But no matter when you plant them, the most important thing is to keep them weeded, fertilized, and watered for the first year for sure, because they're young plants, they don't have a big root system. You got to baby them, keep the weeds out of them, keep them well watered. Once peonies are established after 2 or 3 years, they're pretty tough, and you just don't have to worry about watering them unless you have a dry spell in the summertime. But it's really important to keep them watered the first season they're planted. This is just a couple of pictures. Just took these this morning. These are a 2 to 3 eye on the left and a 3 to 5 eye on the right. And as you can see, the 2 to 3 has 1, 2, 3 eyes. The roots look nice and big and tall. And then this is a 3 to 5 eye. This has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, probably 9 different eyes on that one. It's sold as a 3 to 5 eye. And if you look, the really big ones like this one and maybe this one will probably produce a flower the first year. You most likely will not harvest that flower, you'll deadhead it. But the second year, that will probably give you flowers, whereas this 2 to 3 eye, it'll probably be at least another year before you get them. Another thing to note on this 3 to 5 eye, the roots were so big, they actually cut them off. You can see they cut them off in half because these are probably another 4 or 5 or 10 inches longer. That's fine to do that as long as you've got a good root mass in here, and this has a good root mass here. So there's enough root to sustain these stems when they come up in the spring, the new sprouts. These have a few hair roots just starting here. That's because they're in storage right now in the cooler and they're trying to grow some roots. They'd be much better, much happier planted in the ground, but they'll be fine to store them in the cooler and someone can plant them in the spring. One thing to think about when you plant new plants is sometimes you'll get a sprout that'll come up, say, this one way over here. There's not much fruit attached right below that. So that may grow up and put up a stem, and that stem might die. And you go out and look at your new planting of peonies in the middle of June and there's a stem dying on this plant. You think, oh, the whole plant's dying. But if you dig down, you'll see that that stem was attached to such a small amount of root, there's not enough root to sustain it once it grows. If the rest of the plant looks fine, it's nothing to worry about. If the whole plant is dying back, then you have some other problem you need to research. But if you have a new planting and just one stem is dying, it's usually not a problem. It just didn't have enough root to sustain that eye because maybe when it was divided, that eye didn't have enough root below it. This is just a close-up of those two plants. As you can see here, the really big eyes, this one, and that one will most likely produce flowers the first year. This is the kind of thing I'm talking about. That eye there only has that little bit of root and then hooks onto here. So that might put up a stem and that stem might die off. That's nothing to worry about as long as the rest of the plant is healthy. Plant spacing is also something that's always up for debate. Some people like really wide spacing. If you were to look at anything that's usually geared toward homeowners, home gardeners, it's a spacing of 3 to 4 feet apart. But that's not going to make you money if you have plants planted 3 to 4 feet apart in the field. You just won't have enough plants out to make it worth the cost of that acreage. So I recommend planting plants 24 inches apart in a single row in the field. Or if you want to do more of a bed, you put 2 rows in the bed about 18 inches apart and space the plants still 24 inches apart down each row, but then stagger those within that 2 rows. So it's kind of like a zigzag pattern. You could do a 3rd row in a bed, but then you get to the point where you have to reach over the side ones to pick the ones in the middle, and also you're reducing the airflow as far as reducing disease issues. So you're better off having just the 2 rows within staggered for good airflow. Then the next debate is whether you're going bare ground with mulch or landscape fabric or how you control your weeds. If you're doing the bare ground, you're gonna have to do weed control on the entire piece of land. Either mechanical by hoeing, pulling weeds, or chemical with the weed preventer. Make sure it's something that's listed for peony production. I've heard of people before spraying Roundup around the peonies and they basically damaged the peonies several years before they recovered from having Roundup sprayed on them at the wrong time of the year. Personally, I like landscape fabric. You put that down, cut holes every 24 inches, plant your bare root in there, and then the only things you have to weed is that little square where the plant actually is. And I like to, instead of burning a big foot diameter hole, is to cut an X with the grain of the fabric so those flaps go back down and cover the ground and help keep the weeds out. And then as the plant grows every year, you do need to make those holes a little bit larger. But the advantage of the landscape fabric is you only have to weed those little holes rather than the entire field as far as weed management. You do need to worry about the landscape fabric. If you are growing in the south, it does warm the soil up, which is fine in the spring and summer, but if it keeps your soil too warm in the winter, you may need to shade that in the wintertime by putting some straw or something on it so the sun in January and February is not warming the soil and keeping the plants from getting enough cool. When you plant your peonies, you want to plant them with the eyes. If you saw the other picture, little pink sprouts, those should be 2 inches below the surface. If you plant them too deep, you most likely won't have any flowers. Some southern growers will plant a little bit shallower, and the purpose of that is so that the limited amount of cooling they do get does reach those eyes. Whereas if it was down 2 inches and the ground only gets cold down an inch or an inch and a half, because they're in Georgia or the northern Mississippi, that area, you'll get some cooling closer to the surface, and then you'll get enough cooling. I mentioned earlier about if you are in the southern area where you're kind of on the borderline of not having enough cold weather, plant them on the northern facing slopes so you don't get that summer, the sun shining on the ground in the wintertime, warming it up. On the north slope, if you get a steep enough slope, you wouldn't even get any sun shining on the soil in the winter, or very little. That can help you grow the peonies in the cooler season, cooler location. There are some websites, if you just search Southern Peony, that recommend some varieties for southern growing in warmer areas. If you're not growing peonies in the area already, I'd recommend planting a small planting of 50 plants, 5 different varieties, and make sure they work in your area before you plant 1,000 peonies and find out that you're too warm where you're at. Irrigation is very important in getting the plants established for the first year. Like with any perennial or shrub, you should definitely keep them well watered the first year. And then also in the summertime is when they're producing the eyes, which are the stems and the flowers to next year. They produce those in late July and August. So you want to make sure your plants have enough irrigation then, because if they are stressed in midsummer with the heat, they're not going to put up as many eyes and not put up as many stems and flowers the following year. And then with almost any plant you grow, you want to water the soil, not the plant. Watering the leaves just encourages or increases the chance or possibility of botrytis or other foliar diseases and problems. So you want to keep your leaves and plants dry and water the soil itself. Peonies don't need any kind of support. You see home gardeners have the peony hoops to hold up the peonies, but you're growing a peony and you're going to pick it before it blooms. And even if it were to fall over, it's going to still be fine. You pick it and stand up in a vase and it's fine. So there's no reason to go out and put netting on your peony plants if you're growing them for cut flowers, because you're picking them all before they actually bloom. Netting would just get in the way and make it take longer to plant. The next subject of discussion is to disbud or not. Disbudding is the method of removing all the little side buds on a stem, so the main central bloom gets to be bigger and larger, or you leave the side buds on and those will produce flowers. When I was growing, I never sold wholesale. If you sell wholesale, they require that you remove the side buds and it's just a single bloom on a single stem. I used to like to leave the side buds on because it helped fill up the bouquet. And the side buds would eventually open. Just as the central flower is fading, the side buds will usually open even in a person's vase. This is a picture here of a Sarah Bernhardt. That's one that always has a lot of side buds. There's 3 side buds on here, and the main flower is just starting to open, and these side buds will probably open just as that one's fading. But this is a picture of basically you want to disbud when they're about the size of a pea, and you basically just twist it and pinch them off. You don't have to use a pair of clippers. You're just like twisting it and killing it so it goes away and doesn't develop. Then you end up with the picture on the bottom left, which is a single stem, single flower. The flower is bigger. It does make it easier for packing, either in buckets or definitely in boxes going to the wholesaler if they have been disbudded. But that's something you got to decide if you're selling commercially, wholesale, or to like all the Alaska peony growers. I'm sure they all disbud because they are at the peony standard is that it is disbudded. Personally, I like to leave them on if you're selling locally to a local farmer's market, or even to some local florists are fine with that. There's really no major insect problems for peonies, except for they do get the ants on the buds, but it's nothing that you need to worry about. They're not going to hurt the flower. They're basically eating the sap that comes out around the buds and helping to remove that. One thing is if you are growing the peonies and have no rain in the spring, that sap can sometimes be so sticky that the bud gets stuck shut. Or if you're growing them in a tunnel, which I'll discuss it later to extend the season, they get no rain on them. There are usually no ants in the tunnels, so the sap can sometimes cause a problem with the bud getting stuck shut. Then you might have to hose them off to one time to clean that sap off. Botrytis can be a problem for both the flowers or the stems or the leaves. That's usually from having a wet spring, too much rain, too much water. Overhead watering could be a problem. That's why you want to make sure you space them out enough so there's good airflow, so the plants dry fast after a rainstorm. You can use a chemical control as a preventive prevention, but nothing's going to fix botrytis once it's there. Once you have those spots on the leaves, they're going to stay there. Once you have mold on the flower, it's going to stay there. Nothing's going to fix it. That plant, that stem is done for the year. It's good for next year, but once you have spots on the petals, mold on the flower buds, it's finished for the year. You can also get powdery mildew late in the season, which is basically the white film on the leaves. Usually that happens in August, September. The plants are almost dead. Most people don't treat for that. You could if you wanted to, but they're going to be cleaned up and taken away in another month or so. At the end of the season, you do want to cut down the peonies and remove all the dead plant material. And this isn't something you do by going with a lawnmower and chopping it up and then raking it up. You want to actually cut them and haul it off and put it in the trash and get rid of it. You don't want to save it and put it in compost pile usually, just because there's going to be some botrytis, there's going to be some powdery mildew in there. You want to get that off your farm. You don't want to leave it there. This is just some pictures. This is botrytis in the leaves. This usually happens by July or August. You've already picked your flowers and they're gone. Some people treat for this, some don't. As long as you get that out of the garden at the end of the year, you'll help prevent it from coming back the following year. Like I said, once you have these spots in the leaves, there's no getting rid of those spots. All you can do is stop it from spreading. This is a really bad case of botrytis on some flowers. Obviously, this was not picked. It was a flower that bloomed open in the field, which if you're a cut flower grower, you should never have an open flower in the field. You're going to pick them all and sell them. And if you don't sell it and it blooms for you, you should go out and deadhead that flower just so it gets more energy back to the plant and not making seed pods later in the summer. But this is just a terrible case of botrytis, probably a really rainy spell, probably a week or two or a month after it was blooming. This is a plant here where the flower had botrytis. It was really wet and rotted. But then since then, the weather's dried out and it's all papery dry looking now. But at one point, this was soft and mushy and really gross. This one down here, if you see the curved stem on here, sometimes you get that. And some varieties are more susceptible than others. But if you look at the stem, there's all these little brown streaking and spots. That's botrytis on the stem, and it's causing the stem to be deformed because one side has the botrytis and the other doesn't. That could be as simple as one side had the sun shining on it and dried it off, the other didn't, so the botrytis on one side, and then the stem curls. This one here has a bud down here that aborted. This could be from lack of water, from a drought. Could be a late freeze where this bigger bud didn't get damaged, but this one did. But that bud is dead, it's not gonna do anything. And then this one here is just a picture of the powdery mildew. You usually get that later in the summer, late August, September, when the plants are about done for the season. Okay, for harvesting peonies, one thing, you're always going to harvest your peonies before they open. If you have an open peony in the field, you're doing something wrong. You need to work on your marketing and sell more or plant less. If you're a peony grower, you should always need more and need to plant more every year because you're doing such a good job in marketing. The peonies need to be harvested before they open. If you look at the picture here, the one in the top center, this one here, is a little more ready than it should be, but that's still in the big marshmallow stage, but you're more at this stage here, all the rest of these. And this is Sarah Bernhardt, which is a variety that's been around for 100 years, probably the most common variety grown, big pink flowers. It makes the biggest, prettiest bud of any of the varieties, I think. But you want to harvest them in the marshmallow stage, and it's basically when they're about a day or two away from opening up in the field. When you've grown peonies for a while, you'll get to the point where you can look at that and know that one's going to be ready in 2 days. I need to pick it today. And the other thing you need to know is that when the peonies are ready, you might have to pick them 2 or 3 times a day. Or if you have one of these big farms that's got thousands and thousands of peonies, you may be picking the entire day. Especially if it's a warm day and you get temperatures in the 70s, the low 80s, they're going to pop open so fast. I can remember picking flowers. We pick every peony that's ready on a Saturday, pick them all Sunday morning, go to the farmer's market, come back at 2 o'clock in the afternoon, and there's peonies that are ready to be picked again. So you definitely need to pick more than just once a day. If you're growing peonies, you definitely need to have a cooler to store them in. Nathan will talk about that later about storing them, but you definitely need to have a cooler if you're growing peonies. I mean, when I first started, I didn't have a real cooler yet, but when peony season was in, every entire thing came out of the kitchen refrigerator, all the shelves came out, and I stacked it from peonies from the bottom to the top for 2 weeks so I could hold them throughout the week and sell them the weekends. The other thing when you're picking peonies, you don't want to pick the stems as long as you need them. You don't want to pick it off at the ground, a 3-foot stem, when you only need 20 inches or 18 inches. So pick the height you need and leave as many leaves as possible on the plant, because you want to make sure there's lots of leaves there to nourish the roots and get a bigger, better plant for the following year. When you want to store your peonies, you want to store them in a cooler. I would say 35 degrees. Nathan's probably going to tell you 32.1 degrees or something close to that. You want it usually as cold as you can get it without freezing, but he'll go over the temperatures in more detail. I always felt if you're going to sell it within a week, store it in water. So in other words, if you're picking flowers throughout the week to deliver to the farmer's market on the weekend, or pick it throughout the week and sell to the florist once a week, as long as you're going to sell it within a week, store it in a bucket of water in the cooler in the marshmallow stage. If you need to hold them longer than that, either because you have so many blooming you can't sell them all now, or because you want to store some and to sell them later in the season to extend your harvest by 3 or 4 weeks, then you'll store them dry. And if you know that you're going to store them dry, you basically never even put them in water. When you pick them in the field at the marshmallow stage, they go straight from there, straight into the cooler. Never put in water. You strip off the leaves you don't need. Store them in usually cardboard boxes wrapped in paper. The cardboard boxes usually have a ventilation hole in the end. It's very easy to go to a retail florist and just ask for the boxes if the roses come in. They've always got ones that are thrown away. You can store the peonies in that. But they have to be completely dry when you put them in there for storage. They can't have any moisture at all, or when you pull them out in 2 to 3 or 4 weeks, they're going to have little brown fuzzy mold all around the flower head, and they're trash. So you definitely want to make sure they're perfectly dry when they go in there. And you can store them dry for several months. Nathan will go over that farther in more detail, but basically you keep them in there until you need them, take them out, recut the stems, put them in water, hydrate them for a couple hours, and then they're ready to use or put back in the cooler and use them in a day or two. The longer you store them, the shorter the vase life is. In other words, a fresh peony picked today is going to last you 8 days in the vase. Stored in the cooler for 3 months, you might get 4 or 5 days out of it. But if that bride needs that peony for that wedding in August and you can supply it and charge $5 a stem, it's worth it because it only has to last for that event. Usually you wouldn't use stored peonies in a weekly arrangement, something like a birthday arrangement where they expect it to last for a week, or a weekly arrangement you might make for a restaurant. You wouldn't use a stored peony for that, but it's great for the events. Somehow that's got the same wording but different picture. Just another picture there. Peony production, you can extend the season on the front end by having them ready early by growing them in tunnels. Usually you can gain about 3 to 4 weeks. And look at it this way, if you were selling peonies and they normally bloom for you June 1st to, and you can, I would say your peony season's only about 15 days total from start to finish of the cut flower varieties. There's other single ones that might bloom 3 weeks earlier or some that bloom a little later. But if you've got a peony farm, you're going to pick everything in about 2 weeks from start to finish. You can extend that 3 to 4 weeks earlier by growing some in a tunnel. So if in those 2 weeks when they're normally growing in the field and you sell $10,000 worth of peonies, if you can grow that many peonies indoors, you've just doubled your peony production and peony income for the year. Recommend growing them in a tunnel. Basically, the idea is to cover them with the tunnel 3 to 4 weeks before they normally sprout in the field outside. So if you're in an area where April 1st, you see the peonies, little red, pink color stems coming out of the ground, 3 or 4 weeks before that is when you want to cover them up. I was in Maryland Zone 7B, and I would cover them up the last part of February, and I would get peonies that would make it for Mother's Day, whereas otherwise where I was in 7B, they were always ready 2 days after Mother's Day, the 3rd week of May, not the 2nd. So by having peonies on Mother's Day, you can increase your sales more than double them if you can have your peonies ready earlier. But I'd also recommend don't go out and plant peonies in a tunnel, because then you're wasting that tunnel for the first 3 years before you start to harvest peonies. So normally what you would do is plant the peonies where you're going to build a tunnel, whether it's a full-size tunnel. So go out and plant the peonies, space it right, then build the tunnel over those plants after 3 years when they're at the producing flowers. So there's no reason to have peonies growing in a tunnel that you're not making money off of, you're not selling yet, because then you're just wasting that tunnel space for those first 3 years. The other option is take your existing peony field that you already have, pick some beds that you know what color they are and you want to have some pink and red and white ones for Mother's Day or earlier crop, and put temporary tunnels over those 3 to 4 weeks before they would normally sprout. and then you'll get those ready earlier. You do want to be careful you don't cook them and get them too hot once they are sprouted, so you might have to make sure you watch the tunnels and vent them as needed. But it's very easy to put the tunnel over an existing bed to get some ready earlier. We recommend putting the hoops up in the fall when the ground's not frozen and the weather's more conducive to working. It's not cold, it's not raining. Put the hoops up, and then you just go out someday in March or whenever it is the right time for you, and then just put the plastic up. And not to be out there building the actual tunnel, you're just adding the plastic in the spring. And that will definitely increase your peony production by getting ready earlier. So by growing them out in the field, you get some ready earlier in the tunnel, and then store some in the cooler for later sales. You can go from what was a 2 or 3 week peony season to now have it 8 or 9 or 10 weeks, and really increase your peony income that way. Suggested varieties to grow. Peonies come early, mid-season, mid-late, and late season. Basically, what I've listed here is some that are early, mid, and late that are all good cut flower varieties I recommend you try to grow if you haven't got peonies growing already. But again, like I said, the season from early to late for your harvesting window is still only about 15 days from Charlie's White to a pink giant. It's still only going to be in 2 weeks, you've got all your peonies picked. Maybe 2 weeks and maybe 18 days instead of 15, but it's pretty quick. The warmer the weather, the faster they're going to bloom. So they're just some varieties I recommend you try if you don't have those yet. The most commonly grown one is over here, the Sarah Bernhardt Pink. That variety's been around forever. It produces a really big plant, lots of flowers, quick to be big enough to harvest off of. In other words, if you plant them this fall, you'd be picking some peonies in the year 2021 and picking lots of them in 2022. You can start picking the flowers as soon as the plants have been there for a couple of years, as long as you leave lots of leaves and lots of foliage on the plant. So, and then again, we'd like to thank all the sponsors. It's a lot of different organizations and companies on there that sponsored this presentation. So that's it. So I don't know if you have any questions.
There are plenty of questions online. We will go through some of those.
Let me stop sharing my screen, if I can find that. Now I can go up and look at all the questions. Look at them all, okay.
Yeah, there's some at the top here.
Go back to the beginning.
If you see one that catches your mind, Dave, go ahead and.
No. Well, here's somebody just said, does disbudding make them more susceptible to disease? It shouldn't, as long as you do that on a day that's not raining, because as soon as you pinch that off, that little pinch that you made is going to dry up within a day, and it shouldn't be a place to harbor any disease to start. With some long questions.
Number one peony for cut flower production, general ideas, and why?
Number one growing, as far as I know, is Sarah Bernhardt, because it just produces so many stems, makes a big, beautiful bloom in the marshmallow stage. It's big. If anybody's been into Whole Foods in peony season, that's 90% of what they sell is Sarah Bernhardt. Big, huge buds, ready to burst open and last really well. Someone here just said they're moving to a new farm that has 300 peonies that are well established. Like to divide those to move them to a new farm next year. So in other words, you've got an existing farm you're moving, right? Right, when I'm reading that, they got 300 peonies they want to move. You have two options. Dig the biggest chunk of plant you can and transplant that as one whole plant, and it'll barely know it was moved, and you still have production the first year after you move them. Or you can divide them up and divide them as small as you want, down to 2 to 3 eye or 3 to 5 eye plants. Another option is to take them and, if you're trying to increase your peonies, take them and divide half of them. Take and plant some back as the full plant, which will then be back in production fairly quick. Then take half of the plants and divide them to increase your total number of plants. And somebody here says they disagree with me, they do need support. I'm going to disagree with you and say they don't. Even if it falls over, it doesn't matter. You're growing it as a cut flower. You're going to pick it before it opens. Even if it's fallen over, that bud is still good. Unless you stepped on it, it should still be fine. You cut it and stand it upright, it's fine in a vase. If you're growing as a garden plant, you need support because they're all going to fall down. But if you're going as a cut flower, I can guarantee you, Bernie down in North Carolina grows 100 acres of peonies. I can guarantee you he doesn't support his peonies. And John's shaking his head yes. So yes, you do not need a plant to support peonies that are grown as a cut flower. You just don't.
How about row spacing?
row spacing between it. If you're doing the single rows, you can do a bunch of single rows, and then you need an aisle big enough to get your whatever you're carrying your peonies in, whether it's a trailer with buckets or your truck or your tractor. So you don't want to have this patch that's 100 feet by 100 feet that you can't get to the middle of to carry the peonies out on your wagon or truck or however you're moving them. So you want to have either your beds with the double rows or the single rows, probably 12 feet across or 12 feet worth of that, and then a big enough aisle to drive through to haul the product out. It also depends how long your rows are. If you have a bunch of short rows that are only 30 feet long, but you got 100 rows and that are 30 feet long, 30 feet is not that far to walk to the end of each bed. Whereas if you have 100 rows that are, or 30 rows that are 100 feet long, that's a long way to carry those plants out when they're picked. So you want to have more access down in the middle of the patch, the middle of the field.
Dave, how many stems would you, percentage-wise, would you might harvest off of a plant?
I'm a firm believer. Once a plant's established after the first 3 years or so, if it's got a flower, you sell it. Because you could be hit by a bus tomorrow and never have another one to sell. And as long as you leave lots of leaves on that plant, it's going to come back and without any damage. In other words, you've got a stem that's 35 inches long. You only need an 18-inch stem. Cut an 18-inch stem, leave the rest of those leaves on that stem, and that's going to regenerate the plant for next year. Plus, if you have a plant that has 10 flowers on it this year, it probably has another 10 stems that don't have flowers. So even if you pick every flower stem, there's still stems that came this year that don't have flowers on them yet, that were from the smaller eyes. So I'm a firm believer in pick everyone that's out there. I know I talked to Bernie one time. I asked him if he picks all of his. He says he picks everything, but they don't pick on Sundays. Other than that, they pick everything that's ready. So he does have some that don't get picked. That's because they don't pick that on Sundays. But I'm a firm believer, and if it's a stem that you can sell and make $3, I'm going to make that $3. And that plant won't be, as long as you're watering and fertilizing and taking care of the plant, it's going to come back next year. So I'm a firm believer in picking everyone. I'd like to see what the people in Alaska who are growing lots of them, if they pick everything.
There's a question about if you're going to leave that list of plants up, and yeah, Dave has brought us
I can
with
put
a
that
PDF.
back up, yeah. Yeah, everybody get a PDF of the whole presentation in an email in a day or so. Plus also with that email is sending, there is a list that's got like 300 or a couple hundred peony varieties sorted by bloom time. So it's the ones that bloom early, mid, and late. So you can look at it and say, okay, I want to pick a red, a white, and a pink early, a red, white, and pink medium, and then late blooming. So you'll have that list when he sends out the email in a day or two.
What do you do for a good NPK rate for your fertilizer?
Well, before you use any fertilizer, you should have your soil tested, especially if you're doing peonies, because I did mention that peonies are there basically for the rest of your life. You know, they're going to be there for 40 years, way after you're finished growing. It might be your grandchildren growing them by then. So you should do a soil test, and that's usually I'd have to look it up to see exactly what, but they're not a big feeder. You don't want to give them too much nitrogen, then you get lots of leaves, and the more nitrogen, the more chance of disease problems and just weak plants because they grow too tall, too fast. I'd have to look that up, but we'll include it in the email you send out, the actual fertilizer to use.
Can you speak on mulches and weed control?
Yeah, the weed control, to me, the best thing for weed control is the landscape fabric. Although if you're doing 100 acres of them, like some growers do, or even several acres, you might not do the landscape fabric. There are pre-emergent herbicides that are labeled for peonies. You just want to make sure that it's labeled for the peonies and put down at the right time. The other thing is start with an area that's fairly weed-free. Everybody knows about the seed bank, which is basically the gazillions and millions of seeds that are in your field already. If you're going to eliminate as many of those as possible before you put in your peonies, that'll eliminate what you're fighting for the rest of the peony production time in there. And that means growing the weeds and killing them over and over before you plant your peonies, which might mean you prep your bed, water it really well, let the weeds grow, either lightly till it, or use a flame weeder to kill the weeds so that you kill all the weeds before you plant your peonies. And then you don't have as many weeds to fight with later. But the landscape fabric to me is the best way to eliminate your weeds. I do know a grower that years ago sprayed Roundup on his peony beds in the spring, way before they were sprouting, and then again in the fall after they died from frost. But you got to be really careful because if anything's showing the peony or you put down too much, you can damage them. So with any chemical, you got to follow the instructions on them. Somebody asked about they're in Arizona or Colorado, somewhere really dry, about watering. Start with the overhead irrigation, switch to drip in the summer. why wouldn't you just do drip all the time? Overhead irrigation, especially in an area that doesn't have much water, you're using a lot more water by doing overhead irrigation than you are by doing drip. So if you have the drip down there, just use the drip all the time. You might hand water when you first plant, which you should hand water anything when you first plant it to get the water settled, the soil settled down around the roots. But then drip irrigation uses so much less water than doing overhead irrigation. Plus, overhead irrigation waters all the aisles and makes all the weeds grow in the aisle. If you're in an area with dry ground and you just water the plants, that's the only place the weeds grow. They won't grow out in the aisles.
So Dave, if you're using drip irrigation, where the position of the emitters?
Well, usually people would use drip tape, which is the drip emission emitters are every 6 or 8 or 12 inches, just right up against the side of the plant. If you had a single row, just put a single row drip tape. If you have 2 rows, I'd put a drip tape on each bed, on each row of plants. That way you don't have to water as long. In other words, if you had 2 rows that are 18 inches apart, to do 1 row drip tape in the middle of that, you're gonna have to run a lot longer to water out to that 20-inch width. Whereas you have a row on each bed, you don't have to water as much. Doesn't take as much water.
Have you tried to combat sooty mold or anything to get rid of the stickiness on top of the bud?
Well, the sooty mold would possibly be the sap getting mold on it. That's why I mentioned that if you don't have any rain, that's going to stay on there. The rain washes off and the ants eat it. So if you have a dry spring, you might have to do an overhead irrigation just to wash it off once, but you don't want to keep doing that. And somebody's asked her about you need to use heat in a tunnel. You shouldn't have to heat a tunnel. Basically, the peony buds can take it cold in the upper 20s. It's really a hard freeze that will damage them. So by having them in the tunnel, you usually are protecting from a hard freeze, unless you're in an area like it got down in the single digits or the teens, then you might have to put some supplemental heating in there if the buds are showing or if they've grown really tall before you have that cold spell. But usually starting them in a tunnel is not going to get them ready so much earlier you have to worry about that, unless you're in an area where it goes from brutal cold to really warm in a really short period of time.
Okay, last.
It might be worth mentioning some about the sensitivity of peonies to high soil moisture levels, poor drainage, where they really don't do very well.
Yeah, peonies should definitely be in full sun and good drainage. And again, because they're going to be there forever, you want to do a really good job of planting them. Add lots of organic matter, make sure they have good drainage, and you're not in solid clay soil that doesn't drain. A slight slope is always good, helps drainage. They don't really need a raised bed because they're down deep anyway, so a raised bed's not really necessary, just flat ground. As long as there's not a puddle there after it rains, you should be fine. And if you're in an area with dry soil that drains fast, that just means you need to water more often if you're in a sandy area.
All right. Last question. Can you speak to what types of fertilizer to use, slow release or liquid fertigation?
I've always liked slow release better. If you're using a liquid, you have to do it continuously because it's usually a very weak solution. So usually a longer term slow release fertilizer is better.
All right. Well, thank you, Dave, for your talk on production.
I was just looking through the questions. There's also some people that are answering the questions, making comments. So I hope everyone reads all the questions.